Okay, I have to confess I'm behind this week. It's kind of sad that it's only Monday and I'm that far behind. This lecture was supposed to be posted last week. It's on virtue ethics. This is the third major theory of ethics after deontology and utilitarianism. Here are the topics we'll discuss. And let's get started. Okay, so what's the need for virtue ethics? Well, virtue ethicists see a problem with the other theories. And the problem is this. Utilitarianism and deontology both focus on evaluating actions. That is, those are theories that have a goal of saying of any particular action whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing to do. The problem, though, is that morality is not simply about actions. Morality is also about being a certain kind of person. And that, for the virtue ethicist, is the primary goal of morality, is becoming a certain kind of person. The first virtue ethicist, the most important, well, not exactly the first. Plato was a virtue ethicist. Socrates believed in virtue ethics. But the main theory, and the first person to really develop a theory of the virtues, is Aristotle. Aristotle was born in 384 BC, died 322 BC. He was Socrates's, no, not Socrates. Plato was the most famous student of Socrates. Aristotle is the most famous student of Plato. He's also well known as being the teacher of Alexander the Great. His key work in ethics is a work called the Nicomachean Ethics. There are some other works, but the Nicomachean Ethics is the most important. Okay, but before you can understand what goes in the Nicomachean Ethics, you need to understand something about his work on psychology, which is called On the Soul, or De Anima in Latin. It's a key feature of Aristotle's thought that everything has a purpose, goal, or end. And this doctrine is called teleology. Telos is the Greek word for purpose, goal, or end. So if you believe in teleology, you believe that everything that has a purpose, goal, or end. Another of Aristotle's key doctrines is hylomorphism, that material objects are matter-form composites. So you are made of matter, human matter, that is, but you also have a particular form. You're not just any random characterization of matter. You're matter that's subsumed under some form or another, in this case being the human form. The soul, for Aristotle, is the form of a living thing. The soul is really, for him, it's not a thing itself. It's a set of capacities. And if you believe that, then you can believe that there are different types of souls, because of course there are different capacities. So first, for Aristotle, is a nutritive soul, which are the things, the features that you have that allow you to nourish, grow, and reproduce. The sentient soul is whatever it is about you that allows you to have sensations and also to move around. The rational soul is what you have that by which you reason. It's the things that you have, the characteristics that you have that enable you to reason. Now notice what has the nutritive soul? Plants, animals, and human beings. Sentient soul is shared by humans and animals. Rational soul, that's restricted to humans alone out of those things. Okay, keep in mind though, the soul is not a thing. It's not what we usually mean by soul. It's a set of capacities or a set of functions. Now, he opens the Nicomachean Ethics with this question about what is the ultimate good. Aristotle believes that every rational activity aims at some end. And for it to be a rational activity, rational means reason, so it's done for a reason, and the goal or purpose that you have for acting is going to be the reason you have for acting. So it seems really likely that every rational activity, or it's just true by definition, that every rational activity aims at an end. Now, if there is no ultimate end, then Aristotle believes there's no ultimate satisfaction for human beings. An example for that would be something like this. Imagine that Well, here you are at college, right? So you're taking intro to philosophy. Why did you take intro to philosophy? Because you're in a degree plan that requires intro to philosophy. Why are you in that degree plan? Because you wanted to major in that thing. Why did you want to major in that thing? Because you wanted to get a job in that field. Why did you want to get a job in that field? Because you thought that that field had a high average salary. Why do you want to make a lot of money? So on like that. So notice, if there's not some ultimate answer to all these why questions, then you never actually attain the thing that you're truly satisfied with. There's always something else that you want. So if there's no ultimate end, no ultimate goal or purpose, then no satisfaction. So Aristotle believes it's got to be the case then. We have to believe that there's some ultimate end. Now, what characterizes some ultimate end? Well, here's some features of it. First of all, it has to be chosen for its own sake. Because if it's chosen for the sake of something else, it's not an ultimate end, right? It's only a means to another end. If it's the ultimate end, that means that other things are chosen for its sake. It's the goal, the ultimate goal, not a means to anything, and not chosen for the sake of anything else. The fourth reason, or the fourth characteristic, is that it be complete. It's always chosen for its sake, and circumstances couldn't change this. So if you have this, you're always going to be satisfied. It's comprehensive, which means if you have it, then you have everything that you need. And it's also self-sufficient. If you have it, then you don't lack anything. Okay, so this is what the ultimate end must be like. Now, what is it? Well, Aristotle says everyone agrees that it's happiness. Happiness is the ultimate good. Although, there's a problem, because not everybody agrees what happiness is. So Aristotle discusses four options. First of all, the life of pleasure. He says this can't be the ultimate good for a human being because it's the good life for a cow, not something that's uniquely human. Then there's the life of honor. He says, well, the problem with honor is that it's good, but you're too dependent upon other people giving it to you. So you can't guarantee that you have it. Wealth. The problem with wealth is that money is not intrinsically good. It's only good for the sake of using it to gain some other good. Okay, so the last thing that he considers is the life of wisdom, and that must be it. Now, that in itself is not a good argument. It's only going to be compelling if you think those are the only four options. So he moves on to something else, and that's the function argument. This is the primary argument, the key argument, the most important argument in the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle says first, the good of a thing is performing its function well. Okay, for example, what does it mean to be a good knife? What must a good knife be like? Well, before you can answer that question, you have to ask, what are knives for? A knife is for cutting. So once you recognize what its function is, then you can say what characteristics a good one must have. It must be sharp, for instance. So the function of a thing is its unique activity. What is the thing that it does that nothing else does as well? Well, what is the thing that humans do that nothing else does as well? Go back to those three types of souls. The unique activity of human beings is to reason. So the good of a human is reasoning well. Virtue. Virtue is a character state, okay? To figure out what a virtue is, let's start with happiness. Happiness defined for Aristotle is activity of the soul in accordance with perfect virtue. You should act then how reason tells you to act. Now, a virtue is a disposition, which is essentially a habit to act that's neither excessive nor deficient. Now, those virtues have to have at least a couple of characteristics. One, they provide a motivation for acting. So there's a motivation component. Second, there's a reliability component. Okay, if you have the virtue, you will want to achieve this thing. And second, you will be able to reliably achieve it. Types of virtues. There are two types of virtues. There's a moral virtue and intellectual virtue. Moral virtues, the goal is moral action. And examples of moral virtue include courage. Now, remember, a virtue is a disposition to act that's neither excessive nor deficient. So all of these virtues are going to be what Aristotle calls a mean. And it's a mean between two bad character states. A bad character state is called a vice. So, for example, if you have the virtue of courage, the excess is something that looks like too much courage, and that's rashness. The deficiency would be too little courage, that's cowardice. Now, it's important to note that the excess isn't really too much courage. Too much of a virtue can't be bad, but there's a vice that looks like it's too much of that virtue. So Aristotle wouldn't think that, for example, that the courageous person doesn't feel any fear. The courageous person feels the right amount of fear that's proper for the situation that he or she is in. The person who feels too much fear and can't act as they should, that's the coward. The person that feels too little fear and rushes into places where, let's say, angels fear to tread, as the definition of a fool is commonly said, that person is a rash person. That person's actually not courageous. Intellectual virtues, the goal is not moral action, but truth. So, a bunch of intellectual virtues, open-mindedness, for instance. We talked about this when we did virtue epistemology. For the moral virtues, especially, there's always going to be an emotional component. So the one that's important for courage is fear and confidence. There are virtues for, let's say, how you use your money. Okay, so the charitable person, charity is a virtue. The person who has the excess is kind of a spendthrift that throws their money around on everything. And then there's the miser, that's the deficiency. So all kinds of virtues for Aristotle. How do you become virtuous? People are virtuous. Actions are virtuous because they are what the virtuous person would do. So you become virtuous by developing this habit. You do the thing that the virtuous person would do, whether you want to or not, and eventually you will habituate yourself to doing that. So you'll build the disposition. Okay, Aristotle thought there were four kinds of moral personality. There's the virtuous person, the vicious person, the continent person, and the incontinent person. Now, to understand what those are, it helps if you'll understand the traditional, let's say, breakdown of an action. We explain an action in terms of a belief and desire component. If you have good beliefs and good desires, you do the right thing. Bad beliefs, bad desires, you'll do the wrong thing. But what will you do if your beliefs and your desires conflict? Well, it depends on the strength of your will. Now, let me see what's on the next slide, see if I need to talk about that. Okay, so let me keep talking here before I go on to the next slide. The continent person and the incontinent person both have good moral beliefs, but they have bad desires. The continent person does what their belief tells them to do. The incontinent person acts on the desire. So a good example is somebody who, let's say you're over for dinner, you've already had a piece of dessert, you know you shouldn't have another one, and the family that you're eating at their house, the mother says, would you like another piece of that? I see you enjoyed that first one so well. And you know you should say no. The continent person says, no, I don't believe I should. And the incontinent person says, yes, please, I'll have two, in fact. Okay, so they act on their desires and not on their beliefs. Key ideas of virtue theory. Number one, Aristotle believed for ethics is imprecise. That means there can't be a rule that's going to guarantee to tell you what's the right thing to do in every situation. So something like utilitarianism, the greatest happiness principle, or Kant's principle of universalizability, that first version of the categorical imperative. Neither of those Aristotle thought would work. Human social life is just too complicated. There are too many factors, so he can't tell you in advance of the situation what you ought to do in that situation. So how do you know what you should do? Well, first of all, it helps if you have a good moral education. You came from good parents who educated you well, who taught you how to behave. You're going to have a leg up on other people. So Aristotle stressed the importance both of education and of a good upbringing. Aristotle also was the first to really talk about the importance of voluntary action when it comes to responsibility. Moral responsibility requires that the action be voluntary. Why? Because he thought ought implies can. To say that you're obligated to do something seems to require that you can do it. You can't hold somebody responsible for not doing something they couldn't have done. A problem here is to ask, or is to answer the question about when is a person voluntary, or when is an action voluntary, and therefore a person is responsible. Aristotle tells a story about a ship. Notice, to say that something is voluntary is to say that you wanted to do it, but it actually gets fairly complicated. Here in his story, there's some sailors on a ship. The ship is carrying goods to port. They encounter a storm, and to save the ship, they throw some of the goods over. Well, did they want to throw those goods overboard? No, it seems like they didn't want to. But by throwing the goods overboard, they saved their lives. Did they want to save their lives? Yes, that's exactly what they wanted to do. So what makes an action voluntary is dependent upon how we describe that action. Now, our legal system recognizes that. For example, if someone says that they'll kill a family member of yours if you don't commit a crime, let's say the crime is burglary or something, the law will consider that you were forced to do it a defense. This is called the duress defense. But on the other hand, there's a limit to how what kind of action, what kind of crime you can use that defense for. For example, if the person says, I'll kill a member of your family if you don't kill this other person, the law is not going to let you off for that. That defense won't work. So in that case, they would say, well, you just shouldn't have done it. Okay, Aristotle is also the first philosopher to talk about the importance of friendship when it comes to morality. Several kinds of friendship. There's the first one, the lowest level, is one based on utility. You're friends with somebody because it's useful for you. He says people who engage in business relationships often like this, right? You have this relationship. Why? Because it's good for your business. The second level is a friendship that's based on pleasure. Okay, you're friends with somebody because you enjoy their company. Highest level of friendship is based on a recognition of the goodness, the moral goodness of the other person. Now, Aristotle says that friendship requires relative equality in social terms. I don't tend to like that part of Aristotle. He also says that we can truly only have a small number of friends. Americans tend to think that we have hundreds and hundreds of friends, but really, as far as close friendships go, we can only maintain a small number of those. Okay, here are some key concepts from Aristotle before we leave Aristotle. One is virtue, a character state that makes a person good. Another is practical wisdom. Okay, practical wisdom is knowing how to do the right thing, knowing what the right thing to do is, and also how to do it. Eudaimonia. This is generally translated happiness for Aristotle as this ultimate good, but it's a broader term than that. It's not the feeling of being happy. It's, let's say, human flourishing is a good translation. What does it mean to have a sort of blessed life or a flourishing life? Teleology. We talked about this. This is the view that everything has a person, or has a purpose. So these are key concepts in virtue ethics. Now some objections to virtue ethics. First, a common objection is that virtue theory is committed to teleology, that everything has a function or a purpose. But the objection is that there's no human function. In response, I would say, well, there is a human function, or we ought to think there's a human function if there is a God, because God is responsible for creating everything that exists. And surely God has a reason for creating human beings, and that would be our purpose. So another response is that surely there is such a thing as a good human life. And if there is a good human life, then we can think the purpose of human beings is to live that kind of life. Okay, another objection that's commonly made against virtue ethics is that virtue ethics gives us no guidance in moral dilemmas. A response to that is, well, that's exactly right, in that virtue ethics doesn't give us a rule that guarantees if we apply that rule, we'll get the right action. But that doesn't mean that virtue theory gives us no guidance. Virtue theory says that the virtuous person is more likely to do the right thing. So the virtue ethicist says, if you want guidance, I can't give you a rule, but if you become this kind of person, then it's more likely that you're just going to know what the right thing to do is. Okay, let's close with looking at a practical application, and that's theories of punishment and how they vary from theory to theory. Okay, punishment, when we punish someone in terms of the criminal system, we're doing something that prima facie is wrong. For example, our system of punishment, we lock a person up, or we take their money, or we execute them. In those cases, if they hadn't done anything wrong, it would be wrong to do these things to that person. So since we are doing things that seem to be on the surface wrong, that means that we need a moral justification before we can do those actions. So the moral justification that you give for a system of punishment will vary according to what kind of moral theory you hold. The utilitarian is a consequentialist. So, of course, the utilitarian says our duty here is to maximize good consequences. Now, here are the three consequences of our punishment system. Deterrence, disablement, and rehabilitation. Deterrence is when you prevent someone else from committing the crime because they see that somebody got punished for doing that thing that they're thinking about. Disablement is when you keep a person from committing any other crimes by locking them up. Rehabilitation is when you take that person and by your punishment system, you make them into the kind of person who no longer wants to commit crimes. Okay, those are the consequences. Does our punishment system meet those consequences? Well, deterrence, no, probably not. Disablement, yes. Rehabilitation, certainly not. Okay. Second question is, if you're a utilitarian, and especially if deterrence is your goal, then the more extreme the punishment, the greater the level of deterrence. But the problem here is that seems to justify punishment that is, let's say, excessive. Okay, also a utilitarian can justify punishing the innocent person if punishing an innocent person can bring about the consequences that you want. It doesn't really matter to achieve its deterrent effect that that person committed the crime. What really matters is that other people believe that they committed the crime. Okay, so utilitarianism seems problematic when it comes to punishment. Deontology. The deontologist generally holds a theory of punishment that's called retributivism. Retributivism has the principle called a lex talionis principle, let the punishment fit the crime. Or in the language of Leviticus, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, life for life. Now, that means that if the punishment has to fit the crime, you should never punish an innocent person, and you should never punish somebody more than they deserve. Okay, a problem here is just how much punishment fits what crime. And the reason for that is that we no longer, in our at least punishment system, punish people by doing exactly the same thing to them that they did. So it's not eye for eye, tooth for tooth. What we generally do is either lock somebody up for a number of years, or we take their money, a certain amount of money, for a fine. Okay, well, let's say you fall asleep at the wheel, you're negligent driving, you kill someone, and you're charged with vehicular manslaughter. Okay, we're not going to execute you. That would be life for life. What we're going to do is put you in prison for a number of years. But how many years is that worth? That's hard to figure. That's really an apples and oranges problem. So it becomes a difficult problem for us. The virtue theorist would ask, what are the relevant virtues? Justice, of course, is one. Okay. What else? Is mercy a virtue that's relevant in this feature or this particular situation? And then once you figure out what the relevant virtues are, then you'd ask, what would a person that has those virtues do? I think a good example of a way to look at punishment that a virtue theorist would like is a view called restorative justice. So the goal here under restorative justice is to essentially fix the wrong that was caused by the crime. So the crime commits a harm against the victim. It damages the community. Also damages the person who committed that crime. So what we're trying to do in virtue theory is to restore the community to the state that it was before the best that we can. And if you're interested in that, look at that URL, restorativejustice.org, and you'll read more about that. Okay, so that's how 3 different ways. We've got 3 different moral theories and 3 different ways that they can be applied to this problem of punishment. Okay, that's it for now.